Think about the greatest atrocities ever committed by humans. Well then, forget everything you imagine to be bad, because in this video, you're really going to discover just how terrible this species can truly be. Throughout history, methods of punishment so insane have been created that some are even hard to believe they were actually used, and that's exactly what you're going to see here today. So go ahead and leave your like, click the subscribe button down below, and let's get started. If the name already made you uncomfortable, it's because it describes exactly the kind of cruel punishment people were subjected to. This medieval instrument consisted of a structure similar to a tall bench, but with a top shaped like a pyramid. The victim was suspended and made to sit on the tip of this device, which, let's be honest, was anything but comfortable. The idea behind the Judas Cradle was to cause extreme pain and humiliation without necessarily leading to death. The victim was tied up and slowly lowered onto the point of the pyramid. The weight of their own body made the suffering prolonged, and the executioners would even add extra weight to make everything even more unbearable. This practice was used as a way to extract confessions or punish crimes considered serious. And the most bizarre thing is that the people who created these machines were practically engineers of pain, because every detail was designed to prolong the suffering. Just imagining the constant pressure on the body already gives you chills, right? Imagine being trapped inside a small cage with no room to move and then being lifted into the air for everyone to see. Sounds like a nightmare scenario, but this was one of the most cruel punishments of the Middle Ages. The victim was placed in a metal cage, usually suspended in a public square, and left there to suffer from heat, cold, hunger, and thirst. The worst part is that this punishment wasn't meant to be quick. The goal was to prolong the suffering while the person was exposed to serve as an example. And don't think it was just humiliation. The condemned were often left there until the end of their lives. In some cases, the cages became filthy with what was left of the condemned. Instead of bringing them down and cleaning them, the rulers left them there, exuding a horrible smell throughout the city while birds and other animals took care of the remains, making the scene even more terrifying for those who passed by. Suspension in a cage was mainly used for serious crimes, but the real objective was to create a public spectacle of fear and control. Just imagining the constant discomfort and exposure, you can understand why this punishment was marked as one of the most inhumane in history. If the name sounds strange, wait until you find out how this device was used. The Pair of Anguish was a metal instrument shaped like a pear, but the purpose of this item was far from nourishing or comforting. In fact, it was inserted into the mouth or the udder, down there, of people. That's right, what you're thinking. Depending on the crime, if it was a woman who betrayed her husband or a man caught committing homosexuality, this pear literally went in to punish them. Its operation was as simple as it was cruel. Once inserted, the executioner turned a screw that made the pear open up, forcing the body to withstand absurd pressure from the inside out. This pressure caused unbearable pain and in some cases resulted in severe internal injuries. Although it was a very painful method of punishment, it didn't necessarily lead to death. The prolonged suffering was the real intention. This practice was widely used in the Middle Ages, especially to punish those accused of heresy, blasphemy, or even practices considered immoral. It seems unbelievable that something so small could cause so much suffering, but the Pair of Anguish is a reminder of how far people would go to punish those who broke the rules of the time. If you think you've seen it all when it comes to cruelty, the Iron Maiden will surprise you, and not in a good way. This device, which looks like it came out of a horror movie, was basically a sarcophagus in human form, filled with iron spikes inside. The idea was simple and brutal. The victim was placed inside, and upon closing the door, the spikes pressed into the body at various points. The scariest part is that, depending on how it was used, the spikes were strategically positioned not to hit vital organs immediately, prolonging the person's suffering. In other words, it was a punishment designed to be cruel and drawn out, turning every second into a nightmare. Although many people associate the Iron Maiden with the Middle Ages, there are debates about its real existence or whether it was a later invention to exaggerate the brutality of that era. What is certain is that it symbolizes the macabre creativity people had to punish, creating a device that, just by looking at it, already sends chills down the spine of anyone who has never even come close to one. You can already imagine that something called the breaking wheel wouldn't be anything good, right? This method of execution was one of the most brutal in history and was so visually impactful that people watched it as if it were a spectacle. The condemned was tied to a huge wooden wheel, arms and legs stretched out, and the executioner began to strike the victim's limbs with an iron bar. The goal? To break the condemned piece by piece, leaving the body in a completely distorted position. To make matters worse, the victim was often left there, exposed to the public, until they succumbed to their injuries or ended up dying of hunger. In some cases, they would spin the wheel to make everything even more agonizing. This punishment was used mainly in Europe during the Middle Ages and was reserved for serious crimes like murder or treason. But the true purpose was the public spectacle. Showing someone suffering in such an extreme way served as a warning to anyone thinking of committing the same crimes. It's hard to imagine something so cruel, but at the time it seemed an effective way to maintain order, even if it was at the cost of unimaginable suffering. When I say people were creative in coming up with forms of punishment, it's because they were truly masters at it. This terrible utensil used during the Middle Ages was characterized by having two opposite sharp ends that were attached to the neck, preventing the condemned from lowering their head. Otherwise, the fork would pierce their chest and chin. Due to the fatigue of holding the object for hours, the victims would give in to the weight of their head against the fork, resulting in a horrible punishment. In other words, the person condemned to this method couldn't do anything. They wouldn't be able to keep their neck raised for so long. So, about an hour after being subjected to this method, the person could no longer keep their neck up and would end up losing their life after immense psychological terror and physical exhaustion. This frightening device was used especially to punish women accused of treason, adultery, or even practices considered inappropriate. The design? 4 metal hooks resembling spider legs, created to punish them. The mode of use was cruel. The hooks were heated to the extreme and then used on the victim's breasts. After that, they were ripped off all at once, with excessive brutality. And it didn't stop there. The goal was to cause pain and humiliation, since everything was done in front of others to serve as a warning. The punishment was not only physical, but also symbolic, because it sought to destroy any sense of dignity of the victim, who ended up losing her breast. And what's most revolting is realizing that many of these punishments were created to repress behaviors often shouldn't even be considered crimes. A true horror that was marked as one of the worst forms of cruelty ever imagined. The name, the rack, might sound harmless, but get ready to discover that it was anything but that. This method of torture was as simple as it was cruel. The victim was placed sitting or lying on a wooden device with arms and legs tied at the end. The goal? To concentrate all the body's weight on the tips, and on top of that, apply pressure with a rope, pulling the condemned's arms and legs. To make the situation worse, the executioners often tied weights to the victim's ankles, further intensifying the pressure and suffering. The design was intended to cause serious injuries and, depending on the duration of the punishment, could even lead to death by infection or hemorrhage. This punishment was used to force confessions or as a punishment for crimes considered serious. Just imagining the discomfort and constant pain, it's clear that the rack is yet another example of the macabre creativity that marked the history of human punishments. When it comes to cruel punishments, the iron chair is one that already scares just by its appearance. This device was exactly what the name suggests, a chair but covered by hundreds of sharp spikes spread across the seat, backrest, and even the armrests. There was no way to sit there without feeling unbearable pain. The victim was placed on the chair and often tied with straps to prevent any movement. In some cases, the suffering was worsened with the use of executioners would place hot coals under the chair, heating the metal until it caused burns. The scariest part? This method was sometimes used as a way to interrogate criminals and suspects in an inhumane way. The iron chair was widely used during the Middle Ages, especially in trials of heresy, that is, when the condemned was guilty or suspected of having committed some kind of grave sin, such as choosing a different religion from the most popular one where they lived. Just the name already hints that this punishment was nothing pleasant. The Spanish donkey was a method of torture that took the idea of discomfort to an extreme level. Basically, it consisted of a wooden structure with a sharp V shape on top, resembling the back of a donkey. The victim was placed over this point, with legs on either side, simulating the act of riding the animal. But of course, that wasn't enough for the executioners of the time. To intensify the suffering, they tied weights to the victim's ankles, causing the body's weight to press even more on the donkey's point. The result was unbearable pain, and depending on the severity, injuries that could lead to extreme consequences, even fatal. This method was used to punish or force confessions, being especially cruel because it prolonged suffering in a calculated way. It's frightening to think that something as simple as a piece of wood was transformed into a tool to punish people so barbarically, and worse, all done under the pretext of justice in medieval times. This method of punishment was frighteningly simple and yet brutal. The condemned was tied to a chair or post, with their neck fitted into a metal support. Behind them was a crank that, when turned, gradually tightened the victim's neck. The garrote was designed to prevent the condemned from being able to breathe, but in a gradual, slow, and painful way. The worst part is that, depending on the force applied, the condemned could take endless minutes to lose their life, suffering from the increasing pressure. Widely used in Spain and other European countries until the 19th century, the garrote was one of the most practical forms of execution. It was considered efficient because it didn't generate as much spectacle as other forms of execution, but still left a lasting impression on the audience. A method that, despite seeming simple, was calculated to cause extreme pain and fear, showing the darkest side of justice at the time. Get ready, because this is one of the most disturbing punishments that ever existed. Scaphism, also known as the punishment of the boats, was used in ancient Persia and took the concept of cruelty to an extreme level. The victim was placed between two boats or inside a hollowed-out log, with only their head, hands, and feet sticking out. So far, it seems just uncomfortable, but here's where things get worse. The executioners fed the condemned with excessive amounts of milk and honey, which caused diarrhea. Then they spread more honey over the condemned's body, attracting insects and other animals. Over time, the interior of the boat became a true hell of filth, while insects began to feed on everything they saw, including the person in the boat. The last moments of those condemned to scaphism were slow, caused by infections, dehydration, and sheer suffering. This method not only took the lives of its victims, but made sure to prolong the agony for days, sometimes weeks. The goal was to humiliate and terrify anyone who dared to challenge the authorities. No wonder scaphism became known as one of the most cruel forms of execution in history. This bizarre object, created in ancient Greece, was both a form of punishment and a macabre spectacle. The idea was simple but frightening. The condemned was placed inside a bronze statue in the shape of a bull, and a fire was lit underneath. The heat made the metal heat up until the interior became an oven. The most sinister part of this method is that the bull was designed to transform the victim's screams of pain into sounds resembling the bellowing of a bull. This was done through an acoustic system inside the statue. While the person suffered, the audience watched and listened to the bellows as if it were some kind of entertainment. An interesting fact is that its supposed inventor, Perillus of Athens, was one of the first victims of his own device. This method shows how human creativity can be used for the most cruel purposes, turning suffering into a grotesque spectacle that, fortunately, remained only in the dark records of history. When it comes to extreme cruelty, flaying certainly deserves a highlight. This method of punishment and execution was exactly what the name suggests: the removal of the victim's skin, often while they were still alive. And yes, it was as horrifying as it sounds. Used in various cultures throughout history, the goal was to cause indescribable pain and completely humiliate the condemned. In practice, executioners would begin the removal of the skin at strategic points, usually at the extremities, and then pull it off with blades or even with their hands. The victim would usually die most of the time from shock, hemorrhage, infection, or even cold, for no longer having their skin to keep them warm. The process could be quick. There were also cases where it was done slowly to prolong the suffering. This punishment was used as a penalty for serious crimes or as a way to send a public message. Ancient Persia, for example, flaying enemies was seen as a clear warning that no one should dare challenge the king's power. It's hard to imagine something so brutal being used as justice, but for many it was a normal practice in ancient times. Today, just the account is enough to cause chills. Surely you already know this form of punishment. After all, it was through it that Jesus Christ brought salvation to humanity. Regardless of your belief, this doesn't change the fact that punishment through crucifixion is one of the heaviest possible. Of course, nowadays this method is no longer used, but in the past, it was common to see people losing their lives in this way. In the act of crucifixion, the victim was hung with arms outstretched on a wooden cross, tied or, rarely, nailed to it through the wrists and feet. The weight of the legs overloaded the abdominal muscles, which, tired, became unable to maintain breathing, leading to death by lack of air. To To hasten death, executioners sometimes fractured the condemned's legs, completely removing their ability to support themselves, accelerating the process. But it was more common to place seats on the crucifix, which was mistakenly interpreted as a pedestal. This practice made the victim live longer. In the final moments, speaking or shouting required enormous effort. Anyway, if you thought the nails were the worst part, now you know that abdominal fatigue was what really ended those condemned to crucifixion. Don't forget to subscribe to watch more videos like this.